Reds, reds, reds. We got all the reds. We got reds on the beds. We got reds in the beds. We got reds on the beds. We got red beds, reds, reds, real reds, fake reds, only here. And here, and here, and here.
So, China. Well then, where to go to next? We did the bit last time about the Chinese century of humiliation, and it turned out that that wasn't something you go to a seedy nightclub in London for, but rather a succession of awful crises that got worse and worse until Mao got into power in 1949. So maybe we should start this episode with a strangled analogy. Imagine you are the proud parent of a number of grown-up children, some of whom are going very well and some less well. You raised them all as good communists, but those days are gone, and now you're not even a communist yourself, and most of your kids aren't either. And you get on pretty well nonetheless, mostly. Pretty much, by and large, they all pop over from time to time to seek your advice, ask for a bit of a handout, maybe a hand with the rent, maybe buy one or two of your cheap and cheerful main battle tanks, occasionally buy a little aviation off you. All is going well, all is good. But now imagine that one of your kids, we'll call them Annie. Imagine Annie has done really well for himself. He's got this great big house next to yours. He calls himself a radical Marxist still, but you can't help but notice that his house is a lot nicer, and there always seems to be bits that are being added to it. I mean, last summer he got a new tennis court next to the pool he put in the year before, and this year he's proudly telling you about his blue water navy, which, if we're honest, sounds a lot nicer than yours. In fact, everything he has is nicer than yours. He has bigger cities, bigger investments, a bigger military, and Anik doesn't come over for supper very much anymore. And one day he phones you up and says he'd like to come round. You're having a bit of a disastrous war in Aku. Yes, in Aku, and it turns out that the ICC have just labelled you an international paedophile and war criminal. So you're excited to have Anik over. Maybe he can lend you some cash or sell you some weapons. But then they breeze in, sign a pipeline deal, make noises about how you should make peace with Inaku, which frankly you don't really want to hear, and then foxtrot Oscar back to their palatial mansion next door. And it might be at about this point you wonder if they actually like you anymore, or they've just recognised that you're so desperate that they could take advantage. No guns, no tanks, no shells, no planes, just a deal to build a pipeline so that they can take oil off you at a price that's so low it'll almost cost you more to extract it from the ground than to sell it. But it is slightly better than the rate you can get anywhere else, because they are at least disrespecting those pesky international sanctions by a couple of dollars a barrel. It might be at about this point you start to remember that 200 years ago you may have nicked several 100,000 square kilometres of land off in Arctic, and you wonder if he'll want them back sometime soon, and just what you could do about that if he decided to point that large military at you. In case you haven't guessed who I'm talking about, of course, I'm referring to the relationship between Moscow and China. With an economy 10 times the size of Russia's and a foreign policy that is as morally vacuous as Moscow's, China is emerging from decades of quiet growth and humble requests to take its place on the world stage as the other superpower aside from the US, whilst Russia is reduced to the state of a vassal. So it's worth considering both how we got here and what China actually wants. It is famously one of the most opaque and impregnable governments in the world, after all. And so, for those questions, I'm going to walk into what I'm calling the China zone.
China!
When we left off last time, Chairman Mao had just wrapped his podgy fingers around Beijing and declared the People's Republic of China, whilst conveniently ignoring the nationalists now safely ensconced on Formosa or Taipei or Taiwan or whatever the hell they're calling it this week. In line with good Marxist-Leninist thinking, Mao decided that China must become an industrialised state. However, the CCP and Mao were looking at a country that, in the early 1950s, was perhaps 90% rural and agricultural. He was faced with a huge population of illiterate, apolitical peasant farmers who rented land and who most of the time were just trying to get enough food together to avoid dying, and whilst they occasionally made some kind of profits from selling a little excess, these were subsistence farmers in the true sense of the term. This was a problem. How could a country become a workers' paradise if there were no workers? How could peasants be freed to become workers if they had landlords, if they were allowed to create excess food and sell it for profit, rather than giving it for free to, say, the state or a collective? After a period of consultation and negotiation, in 1958, Mao managed to get himself to a position where he felt strong enough to address this problem and announced what he called the Great Leap Forward. This was a draconian and radical set of policies which dictated collective farms, confiscation of all private property, the building of factories, massive shifts in production, and in particular production of steel, although quite what Mao was going to do with it, he didn't really know. He just knew that the Soviets had lots of steel, and so, damn it, he was going to have some too. He launched apparently mad campaigns like the War on Four Pests, which involved mobilising millions to kill all of the sparrows in China, as sparrows were supposed to damage the crops. Of course, this totally ignored the fact that sparrows also ate all of the insects, which actually then destroyed all of the crops. Mao was a great guerrilla fighter, but what he knew about practical economics, or frankly even farming, could be written on the back of a grain of rice. And much like politicians today, he wore his ignorance as a badge of honour. For example, at one point he declared that he didn't need to brush his teeth, as tigers don't brush their teeth. He saw this kind of gnomic pronouncement as proof of his rustic, earthy peasant thinking. But make no mistake, Mao was not stupid. He had a sharp mind for politics, and he outmaneuvered his opponents for decades. He simply lacked human compassion, and he saw the lives of others as entirely expendable. The Great Leap Forward displaced millions of people. It disrupted traditional processes of famine protection. And as we've seen, it went as far as destroying entire ecosystems to boot, whilst emphasising targets and production quotas of useless commodities with no uses for no other reason than for the glory of the revolution. Taken together with denouncements, arbitrary detention, torture, public humiliation, and worse for missing impossible production quotas, by 1960, China's food supplies had simply failed completely, just as they had in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. The countryside was filled with the dead and dying. The bodies of desperate refugees clogged roads, all of whom were trying to escape one of the greatest man-made disasters in human history. The level of suffering and misery is almost beyond description. In some provinces, villagers were prevented from leaving to search for food on pain of death and starved in place because authorities didn't want the news of the disaster spreading to urban areas. Cannibalism became rife. Between 1960 and 1962, perhaps 30 million starved to death. As hippies in San Francisco began putting flowers in their hair and waving Mao's little red book around, Chinese villagers were literally eating one another. Initially, Mao tried to reason his way out of the crisis, believing that things would improve, but a combination of internal party corruption, fear, revolutionary zeal, and gross mismanagement came together to reduce Mao's actual control over the situation. Effectively, it became a self-fulfilling dynamo of destruction. Mao switched tack and instead tried to move towards the classics of blaming the victims. The millions that were starving were lazy, insufficiently revolutionary, revisionist, and lacked communist zeal for the struggle, and not, lacking basic foodstuffs through gross mismanagement because Mao was a shit leader who now couldn't control what he'd created. Rumblings began in the CCP about his suitability to lead, and genuine horror was felt in significant sections of the leadership. Right in the middle of the Great Leap Forward, a further crisis, this time from abroad, hit the PRC. For anyone with any experience of radical politics or really other human beings formed into a club of any kind, this next bit will sound depressingly familiar. If you really want to watch a fight, get two groups of people into a room who believe roughly the same sorts of things but differ on one or two minor and frankly insignificant details. Sooner or later, they'll pull knives on one another and try and kill each other. This is a bit of an aside, but amongst other things, I have dogs, and so I get involved in trialling specifically spaniels. If you don't know what a dog trial is, or that kind of thing, you can Google it, it's right there. It's a jolly time in the countryside. We have a nice time as handlers. We have a few beers afterwards. The dog thinks it's great. And all of this is good fun, up to the point, that is, where someone mentions a specific genetic disorder, the name of which I am not going to whisper on the off chance that someone watching this knows and my comment section descends into hell. Said condition is rare, genetically complex, and the arguments should be quite subtle. However, the people discussing this are not geneticists, nor indeed are they vets, nor are they really qualified to pass comment in any way, and yet they have views with a capital V. They have worked with dogs for years. They know everything about them. Some of them have badges and bits of paper to prove it. They've won competitions. Therefore, their opinion is much more valuable than, say, someone with a background in biology or a researcher into canine medicine. One mention of said condition, drinks get spilt, faces go red, internet forums melt down, and before you know it, there's yet another splinter group. See also the Catholic Church during the rise of Luther, the Nazis in the Knights of the Long Knives, Stalin's purges of the Communist Party, the rise of the Tea Party of the 2000s, and a million other stupid fights that humans have picked with other humans over words. In communist circles, then and now, the quickest way to denounce someone is to call them a revisionist. The truth is, no fucker really has a proper definition of what on earth that actually is, and whilst we will spend some time a bit later looking at Marxist thinking, there are some holes that we simply don't need to walk down. The point is, Mao said that the Soviets were revisionist. And that, in amongst communists, is fight and talk. His specific beef was Soviet moves to keep towards peaceful coexistence with the West, because whilst Mao and his mob of merry men were inwardly focused on China at the time, they actually planned to perfect their state and then aggressively export that model of Marxist-Leninism abroad on the tip of the People's Liberation Army. That, at least, is the official line that Mao used. However, the real reason may well have been the how that move to peaceful cooperation was made. When Stalin finally croaked in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev took over. Nicky had been frankly appalled at some of the shit that Uncle Joe had pulled, and in 1961 he made the snappily titled speech on the cult of personality and its consequences. You can always rely on the Soviets for an imaginative title. However, it was exactly what it said on the tin. Nicky's point was that a cult of personality, slavishly doing what the dictator said, was not good Marxism, and it had led to the purges, the mass arrests, the torture and so on that had been synonymous with the 20s and 30s, and indeed with the 1940s. For Mao, this was pure heresy, a direct attack upon him and his style of leadership, and the timing couldn't have been worse. The Great Leap Forward was clearly in tatters already, and like all egomaniacs, whilst the speech might have been about the Soviet Union, all Mao could see was a condemnation of Maoism. This led to a really serious breach between the two communist superpowers. Things got steadily worse during the early 1960s, and both sides moved their militaries towards their borders. An actual shooting war broke out briefly at the end of the 1968. The second imperative event to hit China, and which still resonates today, was the Cultural Revolution. I am categorically not going to try and cover everything that happened in the chaos of 1966 to 76, but let's just touch on a few key points. By 1966, Mao's leader was under serious pressure. 10 years previously, a movement called the 100 Flowers had tried to liberalise and open up the state with freedoms of speech that had been unheard of in pre-revolutionary China. Citizens were encouraged to come forward and openly say what they thought of the Communist Party. Mao fucking hated it, and he spent a good deal of time between the 1950s and 1960s eliminating people who said something mean about him. But as we've seen, the Great Leap Forward lurched from disaster to disaster, and talk started again, especially amongst the leadership of the CCP. In Mao's tiny little mind, this just showed that the bourgeoisie, foreign intelligence, or any other element that you might care to mention, revisionists, counter-revolutionaries and so forth, was still active in Chinese society and needed eradicating. And not, because he was a grossly incompetent leader whose primary goals in life revolved around him being in charge, having sex with everybody else's wives, and executing his opponents in ever more imaginative and larger numbers. To cure this problem, which of course was all his fault, Mao reached deep into the dictator's playbook with a mix of good old-fashioned Stalinist purge, some radical Marxist thinking, and a distinctly Chinese twist. In Chapter 1, we saw how that the mandate of heaven was bestowed on a dynasty, but inevitably over time that dynasty would become corrupt and ineffective, at which point the mandate of heaven would pass to a new dynasty and a new leader, and so on, and so on, and so on. Mao sought to use Marxism to bypass this problem. Declaring that the revolution must be a permanent state, and thereby ensuring a mandate of heaven would be in a constant state of renewal, he declared that the four olds, that is, the old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits, must be eradicated and replaced with, imaginatively, the four news, which were, somewhat predictably, new ideas, new culture, new customs, and new habits. All of this was completely amorphous and undefined. In a society on the cusp of collapse, and in the hands of radicals constantly pushing to out-radical one another, you can imagine how wrong this could, and indeed did, go. Mao unleashed a wave of violence and chaos that engulfed China for a decade, and upended the lives of tens of millions. Street violence, deliberate starvation, collectivization, repression, imprisonment, self-criticism, endless denouncement, public trials, executions, deportations. It went on and on and on and on. My father-in-law lived in Hong Kong at the time at the mouth of the Pearl River and remembers customers on the ferry service to the new territories regularly having to fend dead bodies off for fear that they would get stuck in their propellers. No one was safe. Not teachers, not peasants, not party leaders, not university lecturers, not party officials. Red Guards, often made up of children and teenagers, held impromptu courts-martial in village squares and meted out brutal punishments. Ancient temples were burned, Confucianism was banned, traditional art forms were outlawed, artworks of unimaginable age were melted down for yet more fucking steel. China essentially tore itself apart from the inside, searching for the enemies of the revolution, both physical and cultural. As a critical part of the Cultural Revolution was a thing called down to the countryside and up to the mountains. Contrary to what you might be thinking with a name like that, this was not a daytime television special on some dodgy channel you've never heard of, but rather an idea that if you wanted peasants to become more urban and you wanted urban students to know what it was to work, you should force the two of them to mix together. Hundreds of thousands of young people were declared to be counter-revolutionaries and were exiled from their homes, dispatched to the countryside to live and work amongst peasants. The organisation was abysmal. There was no central planning, no proper support. Its application was essentially pot luck. Some were able to return home after just a few months. Some were effectively held hostage for years. Some simply disappeared. Many peasants, themselves on the very boundary between life and death, just saw these strange, semi-educated youngsters from the cities as useless extra mouths who were unable to perform even the most basic functions and often left them to become vagrants without food or shelter. And all of this, in Mao's eyes, was a jolly good thing. Into this maelstrom of chaos and upheaval, a young boy called Xi Jingping was thrown. Aged just 13, Xi's father and sister were beaten to death by Red Guards, and his mother was forced to denounce him as a counter-revolutionary in front of a baying crowd in Beijing. He was, like 17 million others, deported to a rural village under the Down to the Countryside programme. Exactly what Xi's experiences were is impossible to know for certain, but should you be so minded, you can now go to the village and visit where Xi was sent. You can see the cave where he slept, you can see the places that he ate, you can see the areas where he worked, you can probably take a poop where he took a poop. It's a bit of a sort of weird amusement park for the Communist Party. It's really quite strange. According to various reports, Xi managed to escape back to Beijing only for his mother to report him again, at which point he was redeported back to where he'd just come from. I imagine Golden Week ran family dinners were a little bit awkward after that when he got home in 1975. If this sounds like the sort of scintillating stuff you'd like to know more about, China TV is apparently in the process of filming a 45-part drama on the subject. My insomnia is bad, but it's not that bad, so if anybody does care to watch it, please do leave a review below. Xi claims that his political awakening happened during this period, and he joined the party in about 1970. And I'm absolutely sure, for one, as I'm sure you are too, that he joined the party for ideological reasons and not in any way because he wanted to go home. As a good dictator, he now says that all of this was jolly good for him and it was an excellent learning experience. But it's pretty clear from his behaviour since taking power in 2012 that he abhors instability and change almost more than anything else. His stance on China's response to COVID-19, as an example, was mass lockdowns and total state control of everything. He hates change, and I suspect it goes back to this period of time. More generally, these years of upheaval and chaos left a deep scar on most Chinese lives that you'll still be able to find today if you dig around a bit. You'll be hard-pressed to find anybody in China who'll say a bad word against Mao, not least for General Secretary Xi, but no one wants to return to the state of constant revolution that Mao epitomised, not even Xi himself. Mao eventually turned his toes up in 1976, ending the Cultural Revolution, and by 1978 most of the extreme radical left elements who'd overseen its brutality had been purged from the party. Coming out of the Mao period, the Chinese Communist Party went into a bit of a huddle, and it was presented with a very difficult question. How do you account for and overcome the atrocities that you've all just lived through without causing a second revolution? By 1985, under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, the party concluded three things. First, the collective leadership by the Politburo was vital for China. A single agreed direction with no specific individual in charge, or at least no individual holding too much power. Second, that the cult of personality must be suppressed as it had caused so many problems and so much harm. Third, future leaders must have a limit placed on their terms, be they presidents, general secretaries, chairmen, whatever. Deng was a titan of Chinese politics and perhaps the man who did more than anyone else to drag China kicking and screaming into the modern era whilst maintaining stability and controlling radicalism. He was no saint, as we'll see in a moment, but he was arguably the right man to prevent the chaos that could have erupted during a post-Mao era. As the 1980s came to an end, the Soviet Union began to dissolve, and it was clear that China would not be able to continue as it had before, and that reform was necessary. The naturally cautious Communist Party pushed back, but Deng was able to bring in reforms using a formula he called crossing the stream and feeling for the stones. A cautious, step-by-step set of limited reforms to introduce some free market elements. On the one hand, he dangled the carrot, wealth and prosperity for party members and, of course, some members of society. And on the other hand, the stick of state power and the stack of extra-legal mechanisms for enforcing his will. On the night of the 3rd, 4th of June, the People's Liberation Army moved into Tiananmen Square, supported by special police units, and liquidated a month-long protests which had been occurring there. Perhaps 6,000 people were killed or wounded on that night, and thousands more arrested in the following weeks. There are still people doing hard labour from who were arrested on that night. The democratic movement in China was effectively destroyed. After that point, reforms focused on improving the living standards of the average Chinese citizen, but not necessarily their rights to personal freedoms. Crucially, there is no single rule of law over all, and there is no separation of judiciary from party and state functions, and significant elements of the state are just simply outside the law entirely, which sounds great if you're on top, but it actually means you're just as fucked if you get into a political fight with someone who doesn't like your face. In a room full of psychopathic dialectic Marxists, Deng is the least worst, but it's a low bar and he barely cleared it. China remains essentially an open-air prison camp with sweeties for the well-behaved. And this failure to reform under Deng, and in particular the failure to adopt a separation of powers whilst establishing a market reform, has had serious implications for China today. Firstly, the system remains a virtuocracy. One's adherence to the state and its ideologies dictates one's position in society. And this has been taken to extremes with the advent of tracking system and closed social media like WeChat. Every citizen has a virtue rating. If it drops too low, you can lose access to basic services like housing, to jobs, to benefits, and to civil society generally. And it can all be tracked electronically, remotely, and centrally. Sneeze on a train, get caught with a speeding ticket, travel without permission, post something inadvisable on social media. All these things will lead to your virtue rating and your position being degraded. It's a dictator's wet dream, and it has seen the almost total destruction of anything approaching a discourse in civil society. Of course, all this has been, up to until very recently, offset by the chance of getting filthy rich in a booming economy, or at least not having to worry about where your next meal comes from. You can have the latest smartphone, you can have designer clothes, a penthouse flat, a high-flying executive job, if you comply and you have good connections with the party. But corruption and arbitrary arrest have become core facets of modern China as a result too. At the 20th Party Congress, Xi removed term limits, stepped up his cult of personality, and for the first time in 2 generations, rolled back to revolutionary Marxist thinking over and above trying to make people feel the benefits of the economic wave that Deng brought in. Xi isn't Mao, but he is Maoist, and his change of pace is alarming for people inside and outside of China. Well, I think that's probably a good place to leave things for today. President Xi is busy consolidating power. He's come back from seeing dear old Vlad in Moscow. He's got the pipelines he wanted to have, and he's given absolutely nothing away in the process. We've managed to look at one of the most depressing periods of Chinese history, the unending series of disaster that was life under Mao, and we've survived. Next time, assuming I don't lose the will to live to try and write it, we'll have a crack at some easy ones, like, what the fuck is China? What is its economic system? What does Xi really want? And by the way, it's Taiwan. And what does that mean for the war in Ukraine, for Russia, and of course, for the rest of the world?